Hello and welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and joining us again for an update, Professor Glynn Williams from UMass Dartmouth, as we talk about the war in Ukraine. And it's been a couple months. I checked back, and you and I had talked late in May. So it's been about 2 months since you and I spoke. First, thanks for coming on. As always, I appreciate it. Your shows are well received, not just here in New Bedford, but really throughout the cable world. Actually, a lot of people have picked up the show, so I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So, as I said, the last time you and I spoke, it was in May, and I guess my first question is, from your assessment, where are we in this conflict?
So, the war began on February 24th. So we're over 4 months into a war that Vladimir Putin erroneously thought would be a fast shock and awe style decapitation invasion. He'd march in and topple this government in Kiev and destroy democracy there and bring it into Russia. And he would be famous. It'd be his legacy. He's the one who destroyed this NATO-leaning, Western-leaning country. That grand design, that grand plan collapsed in the first few days. They failed to get Kiev. They got repulsed. Kiev, we've seen all the images, the burnt tanks, the Javelin missiles were used with great effect by these brave Ukrainians who stunned the world, stunned the Russians, stunned myself. No one saw them fighting this effectively and this bravely. So they repulsed the main effort. So plan B became for Putin to try to annex these territories in the east, called the Donbass.
Which were already under Russian influence in many cases.
In fact, you're correct. In 2014, recall Putin did invade and conquer half of that territory. So his aim was now to lower the expectations, lower the objectives, and just annex this sort of very vital area of Ukraine, which is full of resources, and create a land bridge from this area, the Donbass, down to the Crimea. And we're there right now. It's plan B. It's a brutal war of attrition. The Ukrainians are fighting back, but they're losing hundreds of men per week. The Russians have tremendous losses. According to the CIA, they've either had killed or wounded casualties 75,000 troops. So it's a grinding war of attrition. You have this almost unstoppable force of the Russians against an immovable object called the Russians. So we're at a stalemate right now.
Where, the first thing I think of too, and you kind of talked about the numbers of the soldiers and deaths. I mean, there's only so many. Do you think Putin's plan, I guess, in a war of attrition to just keep going until basically the Ukrainians have nobody left?
Yeah. And the irony about that is that the Ukrainians have a huge manpower advantage over the Russians. As their country, hundreds of thousands of them have come out, men, women, the elderly, the young, these volunteer forces, the territorial defense units, they come out en masse. So the Ukrainians, of course, have the advantage in manpower, whereas the Russians have the advantage in artillery, the god of war. So it's a battle between the Ukrainians who are willing to fight. They have a lot of people willing to fight, but they don't have quite the equivalence in heavy weapons with the Russians. Whereas the Russians have a smaller force. It started out the war with 190,000 troops. Maybe 25,000 of them are dead by now, according to British estimates. And the Russians are not at a wartime footing. This is a peacetime army. So I think his plan is to throw his Russian troops into these combat. The Russians don't care about combat deaths, and try to just break the Ukrainians' fighting spirit, which has proven hard now because the Americans and NATO are pouring in these howitzers, 177 howitzers. They're pouring in these effective systems called HIMARS, which are amazing. And finally, the Ukrainians are getting some equivalency on the battlefield when it comes to artillery.
I know that President Zelensky is actually the first lady actually was speaking to Congress a couple of weeks ago as well. They're trying to keep the war on the forefront. Has that been an issue, not in Ukraine, obviously, but in the world, that people might be getting just tired of this?
I don't think war fatigue has impacted any NATO member government. or military or the Biden administration. Sure, it has passed off our radars, because we're focusing on inflation or monkeypox or whatever it is, the latest story of the day. We have a attention span of about a week. So it is no longer seizing headlines. But fortunately for the Ukrainians, the Biden administration is still pumping in weapons, still pouring in money. NATO is doing the same. In fact, the Biden administration is now thinking about pouring in F-15s and F-16 jet fighters, which would mark a massive escalation in the war. And I think everybody's no longer afraid of the Russians. When this war began, the Russians were 12 feet tall. Now they're about 6 feet tall. And we're not afraid to ship howitzers, which was unthinkable 6 months ago, 4 months ago, 3 months ago. Howitzers are massive cannons. And these HIMARS systems are really taking a toll on the Russians. So I think we're being resilient. The arsenal of democracy, America, is standing by. And combined with the fighting power, the willpower of the Russians, we might see them grind down the Russians just like the Finns did the Soviets in the 1939 Winter War.
It's interesting, too, because it seems to me, since the last time we spoke, that Ukraine, with their weapons, has actually become more, I don't want to say aggressive, but they have been actually getting strikes in Russian territory now, more than they did in the first couple months. And I don't want to say been on the offensive, but they seem to have actually done. Yeah, I guess, yeah, they have been on the offensive more than they were.
Yeah, and I think you could use the word offensive. About a month ago, 6 weeks ago, they launched these bold helicopter strikes by these MiL-24 Hinds into Russia proper to blow up oil depots deep inside Russian territory. They went offensive and sank the flagship for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, with an offshore weapon. And now they're launching a ground offensive to seize the first city that the Russians seized in the war in the south, the city of Kherson. They began it by blowing up much of the bridge that links Kherson, which is in the west, to the east. And this may make it hard for the Russians to resupply their troops in the southern town of Kherson. So an offensive is always a dangerous proposition. You need to have either a surprise or more troops, and the Ukrainians have neither one. Right. But hopefully the logistics have always been a problem for the Russians. Jack Pershing, this World War I general, once said, armies win battles, but logistics win wars. And the Russians have been deplorable in resupply for the troops and logistics. So maybe the lack of logistics will give the Ukrainians the advantage they need to march south and liberate the first town from Russian hands, Kherson.
And the Russians have been indiscriminate in what they're shooting, where they're shooting, what they're shooting, who they're shooting. It just seems there's no rhyme or reason. I mean, they've gone to Kyiv, they avoided Kyiv for a while, but then they fired some volleys in there, and they've gone to different spots. It doesn't seem like they really have a rhyme or reason as to what they're doing right now.
There is actually a rhyme and a reason. It is to terrorize the Ukrainian people. State-sponsored terrorism. The greatest terrorists on the planet right now are the Russians. They're lobbing these artillery, we've got multiple rocket systems into civilian-packed neighborhoods. They wiped out the city of Mariupol, a city of 400,000 people, has been wiped off the planet as effectively as if it was hit by an atom bomb. Right. You don't need a nuclear weapon these days to totally Dresden or Hiroshima or Nagasaki, a city. You can just level it from afar with artillery and indiscriminate bombardments. And that's what the Russians have done. They've killed thousands and thousands of Ukrainian civilians, most notably in a train station in Kramatorsk, when they bombed the station with a cluster bomb that said "for the children" on the side. They bombed a theater in Mariupol. They had in big bold letters written out in the front, "Детки," which means children in Russian and Ukrainian. They bombed and killed hundreds. So the objective is to kill, maim, destroy, and terrorize Ukrainians, and in so doing, break their fighting spirit, just like they tried doing in Bucha, when they went there and massacred everybody and raped girls and raped women and set them on fire and burnt them alive. Why do these war crimes? Why do My Lai-style massacres every day? To break the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians. But it's not working. It's infuriating the Ukrainian people. It's driving even the Eastern Ukrainians, who are ethnically Russian, to join with Ukraine. It's solidifying and unifying the nation behind Ukrainian resistance. And inadvertently, it's also linking Ukraine to NATO. It's becoming a NATO compliant force almost overnight. So everything Putin set out to do with this so-called special military operation, you can't call it a war, you get arrested. Everything he set out to do has backfired. His economy has dropped from number 11 to number 22. NATO has now been added to by Finland and Sweden, which is a nightmare for the Russians. It gives NATO 800 more miles on their border. So the whole operation has been catastrophic for the Russians.
But it doesn't sound like, you just look at it and it just doesn't seem as though there's any end in sight either. I mean, despite these obviously positive things, if you will, from the Ukrainian side, they've got the support. I mean, they're losing lives, and obviously that's not positive. But as you said, things have backfired. Russia doesn't even seem to care that these things are backfiring. They're just going to keep going.
And that's the sad part of it. Polling shows that 85% of Russians support Putin's fiasco in Ukraine. Nationalism has been stoked by the Russian media, by Putin. So they're going to double down on this. And I don't see an end in sight either. For there to be an end to this slog, this war of attrition out there on the eastern plains of Donbass, it's almost like a World War II style battle, against the Nazis and Germans, for example. For this bloody war, the largest war in Europe since World War II, by the way, for this war to end, both sides need to see an advantage in ending it. And right now, Ukrainians feel the wind's behind their sails. They're getting lots of supplies and weapons from NATO and America. The Biden administration is pouring in billions to support the Ukrainians. We're fortunate, and Ukrainians are fortunate, that Trump isn't president right now. He's always pro-Russian. But the Biden administration and NATO are standing strong. Ukrainians are standing strong, and they're angry. Ukrainians don't see any need to back down the war right now when they're bleeding the Russians in this costly war when it comes to finances and lives lost. Russians have lost more lives in Ukraine than they lost in the 9-year war in Afghanistan in the 80s. So the Ukrainians don't see a need to back down. And Putin has banked his legacy on this war. It's going to be his contribution to Russian history. And the Russians are blindly following him off the cliff due to propaganda. State TV is always talking about how the Ukrainians are all Nazis. Right. So, Ukrainians are defined as Nazis in Ukrainian and Russian propaganda. So neither side at this moment has any incentive to end this meat grinder war of attrition in eastern Ukraine.
And it does seem as though Russia is just becoming more and more brutal with the methods that they're using in this war.
Yeah, and I predicted that on our first show. I said they won't be able to capture this country. They don't have the troops to do it, first of all. You have to mobilize millions to conquer and annex Ukraine. It was foolhardy to go in with such a small army. It took us a larger army than this to fight a war in Iraq, and we have a much better army than this incompetent, really poor morale Russian army. So that was never going to happen. I think the Russians are going to keep slogging at it, and it'll go on until maybe Putin dies, or there's some sort of breakthrough on the battlefield that pushes both sides to negotiate and try ending the war. But the Ukrainians are saying now, we're not going to stop fighting until we repulse the Russians from our country in its entirety, except for Crimea in the south.
One of the interesting things, obviously, that's transpired recently is the shipping of grain, food. As you said in the first show, Ukraine is really the breadbasket of the world, and it feeds a lot. And those ships have been stuck in Odessa since the war started, and people are starving across all over the world. There's no question about it. The first ship just left, I think, a week ago, if I'm not mistaken. And there were, my understanding is there's over 20 ships still waiting to go. But there was an agreement. It was between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey was involved, and so was the UN. Do you see? Well, first, let's talk about just the impact of that taking place.
That's a huge development. Yeah, and that's a huge development. As you said, Ukraine is a major global breadbasket. It has more arable land than any country in Europe by far. A lot of that grain goes to the Middle East and Africa. And when the Russians went in there and blockaded Ukraine's waters in the Black Sea and stopped the shipment of this vital resource to Africa in particular, it's causing famines. People are dying in Africa because they're not getting this grain. So UN intervened and tried forcing the Russians to stop blockading the shipments of life-giving Ukrainian grain to the world. We saw a couple weeks ago, they finally signed a treaty in Istanbul to allow shipments. And the day they signed it and the shipments were about to begin, the Russians bombed the port in Odessa.
Right.
So there was fears that the Russians were not going to recognize and honor this treaty. But fortunately, the first shipment, as you mentioned, passed through the Black Sea and through Istanbul. So it's on its way. And hopefully, this brutal war of Russian aggression against Ukrainians will stop negatively impacting and costing people's lives farther afield than just Ukraine, as the shipments begin to flow once again to Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere.
And it's interesting. I saw one news article that in Africa where they're saying now that they have to worry about the starving more than they have to worry about the people that are hungry. And you sit there and you're thinking, well, what's the difference? But they actually do have to put that priority, that people who are, I guess, near death versus the people who are, quote, hungry. You just can't imagine what either one is like.
Right. When you factor that into the equation, Putin has probably killed more people on this planet than anybody else alive today, except for maybe Assad, the dictator in Syria. You know, he's killed tens of thousands in Chechnya in his war in 1999, 2000, 2001, which I write about in my book, Inferno in Chechnya. He wiped cities off the map in that war. This is how Putin came to power, as a city murderer, citycide, I call it in my book. And he waged genocidal war in Chechnya. He invaded Georgia in 2008. 2015, he joins the war in Syria and wiped out Aleppo, the largest city in Syria. This is a mass murderer, a genocidal maniac who also invaded Ukraine in 2014, annexed the Crimea. So he's been on a bloody rampage ever since he came to power, 1999, 2000. It's remarkable to me that the Republican Party ever embraced this monster, this anti-democratic man who unleashes rapists on countries, a mass murderer, an invader of US allies like Georgia and Ukraine. How that party embraced this dictator under Trump's influence is still a mystery to me. Because I grew up under Ronald Reagan, who was a staunch Cold Warrior, and told the Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I think this war has, ended a lot of that romance between Republicans and this bloody dictator.
Where do you see, as far as Odessa, which is critical in Ukraine, President Zelensky has vowed that he's going to keep Odessa. It's a critical port, obviously. And obviously now they have an agreement that they can get the vessels out with the food. How do you see Odessa right now? Is that a key strategic point that Russia wants?
I don't think it's in the capacity for Russia to go on the offensive and push from the Donbass. They're already being ground down. They're making almost no progress in the Donbass. It's a stalemate there. And they're on the retreat. They're being surrounded in Kherson, which is to the east of Odessa. So the Russians don't have near the logistic capacity or manpower or the fighting spirit to punch their way all the way across southeastern Ukraine and seize this major lifeline, this key vital heart of Ukraine connecting to the world. They don't have the capacity to ever take Odessa at the rate they're going right now. They're just being attrited on the battlefield at a level no one expected. And they may have dreamed about making Ukraine landlocked by seizing the entire Black Sea coast and the Azov Sea coast and seizing Odessa, the real prize in this war now. But those dreams have faded long ago.
I was going to say, is Odessa sort of a line in the sand for the NATO and its allies? Then, well, we can't let them take Odessa. It's too important to the world's economy.
Yeah, I think the line in the sand has been crossed by Russia several times before. Yeah, and now the gloves are off. The gloves are off. NATO has never been more unified. The sheer fact that Finland and Sweden, who've been neutral since 1945, have jumped ship from neutrality and are joining NATO. The Germans, in their constitution, don't give any weapons to belligerents. When the war began, they offered to give 5,000 helmets to the Ukrainians as a joke. Now the German Bundesreich, the Republic government, is sending anti-aircraft tanks. Tanks. The Poles are sending spare parts for jets. The Czechs are giving them S-300 massive high-range anti-aircraft missiles. We're pouring in more of these HIMARS, which are remarkable. They're mobile weapons that shoot multiple rockets, and they're called shoot and scoot. You shoot the rockets and you just drive off quickly before the Russians can respond by tracking down your position. And everything's off now, the table now. In fact, the fact that the Biden administration is talking about sending F-15s and F-16s, fighter jets, advanced fighter jets, it'll take training to fly these things, like it took training to use American howitzers or HIMARS systems. But I think the line has been crossed, and NATO is now on a war footing. And I think Putin is stunned that NATO, which seemed to be so apathetic when he invaded Crimea in 2014 and annexed the Donbass and the Crimea, is now really full force, full-fledged, almost in a proxy war supporting Ukraine, which is de facto a NATO ally now.
Is there still concern with those neighboring countries in Ukraine that were worried that Russia would go into them as well? They're small countries. Some of them, probably don't have the military that Ukraine does. Is there still concern that Russia will go into those countries?
The most vulnerable countries are the teeny Baltic republics up in the north there, north of Belarus, up near Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. But I think everybody is under the Article 5 NATO security umbrella, which says if one country's attacked, we're all attacked.
Right.
And I think, if anything, the complete decimation of Russian forces, the humiliation of Russian forces, the complete stymieing of this supposed the best tank army in Europe by Ukrainians, men, women, citizen fighters. This has emboldened the NATO countries around Russia, from the Baltics to Romania to Czechoslovakia to Hungary. And I think they're all more now willing to take on the Russians and support the Ukrainians. And I think aware of the fact that the Russians couldn't even take Ukraine, which had a shambolic army compared to an actual fighting force in NATO, with the state-of-the-art aircraft and weapon systems and training. NATO forces are much better prepared for war than the Ukrainians were. So, God forbid, the Russians tried steamrolling through Ukraine, which they have been able to do, and trying to get to an actual viable NATO force, they would be eaten alive.
The last time you were on, we talked about drones and how technology has changed with the war and how drones were playing an impact. As we go 2 months later, what sort of technology have you seen that has changed the way the war has gone for both sides, really?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest game changer, the biggest innovation in this war has been the role of these asymmetric systems that give the weaker party, the David, an advantage against the Goliath, the Russians in this case. The most famous weapon system, of course, is this remarkable anti-tank weapon, the Javelin, created by the Americans. It has really proved to be deadly on the battlefield. It took away the Russians' greatest advantage, their tanks. This is a much better weapon than anything we've seen before. It flies up over the top of a tank. It can penetrate any armor in the world. It has about 85% kill ratio in Ukraine. Ukraine is now a graveyard of hundreds of armored vehicles from Russia, tanks and armored personnel carriers. So Javelin has proved to be a real game changer. In fact, the Ukrainians have labeled it Saint Javelin. They love this weapon. Another key weapon, you mentioned drones, has been this remarkable Turkish-created drone called the Bayraktar. It means banner. This drone was supplied to Ukrainians by Baykar, a industrialist in Turkey related to the president. And this drone has been used with tremendous effect by the Ukrainians against the Russians. They bombed an airfield in the south there. This drone played a key role in distracting the Moskva, the Russian Black Sea battleship, so that a Ukrainian missile, could blow it up. This drone has been dropping bombs and IEDs on Russian troops and terrifying them, providing reconnaissance information, surveillance reconnaissance information for Ukrainian artillery. So that's been another major game changer. And of course, these HIMARS, which are new to most people. Every war has some new invention. Whether it be the biplane in World War I or the P-51 Mustang in World War II, the Huey helicopters in Vietnam, so on. The Abrams tanks in the Gulf War I. But I think in many ways, it is a HIMAR that's really going to be a game changer now. Because this gives the Ukrainians, I think we give them 8 of them already, and it's going to go up to 16, the chance to fire back and blast away at Russian positions and then maneuver and escape before their trajectory has been geolocated by the Russians. So the HIMARS are a tremendous game changer in this war. And I think the public's going to learn more about those in the coming months and weeks and sadly, probably years.
We've only got a couple minutes left, but I'd be remiss not to ask you your thoughts on, there was an article I know in the paper not that long ago, but one of the things that is happening, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine right now, where the fighting is going on, is you see Russians basically taking children, kidnapping children and bringing them to Russia. And for the most part, they're never seen or heard from again. It's literally kidnapping going on. And we're talking hundreds of kids, according to the article and according to some folks in Europe that have looked at it. And again, I kind of look at the line in the sand, and there's no retribution. Nothing can be done. It appears.
And that's the tip of the iceberg. You're correct. They have been kidnapping children, taking them from orphanages. If you're lost without parents, then they just take you to Russia and give you some Russian family. But hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are living in these areas they've conquered in Donbass, they've been deported. Vast internment camps. They brought in the system to do almost like World War II Nazi-style deportations of Jews. Only now it's Ukrainians. So it's a massive war crime. And all we can do is wring our hands in frustration as Americans and hope that Ukrainians fight this brutal, mid 20th century style Nazi or Stalin-esque invasion, defend their integrity, defend their women and their children, and prevail against this Putin monster and his regime that are so anti-democratic and also anti-humanitarian. And the killing of the children, the deportation of civilians, kidnapping of children, the mass rapes of women and girls in Bucha. This is the epicenter of the largest war crime on the planet right now. And I'm delighted to see the Republican Party has finally come around, along with the Democrats, to offer a unified front. They had a vote just last week, 190 to 1 people voted to allow, in America, the Congress, to allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO. One Republican, Josh Hawley, voted against it. I don't know why. But the America is unified, like it wasn't before when it comes to Russia. There was a lot of hand-wringing on the part of the Republicans about a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, when the real enemy was lurking right there the whole time, Trump's friend Putin. So I think this has unified America. It's unified NATO. It's unified the Ukrainians. And we'll see what this great alliance will do against this country that is bleeding. Russians are bleeding. Their economy is dying. Their air fleet, is based upon Airbus from France and these American McDonnell Douglas jet aircraft for passenger planes. It will be unflyable, unmaintainable within 6 months because all the spare parts come from the West. There's no more BMWs there or Starbucks or Shell. All kinds of big companies have pulled out. Right. The country's isolated. It's a pariah state. And I think ultimately in the long term, this will be a catastrophic mark on Putin's record and on the Russian people's record.
Well, there's a lot we've digested a lot, and there's just a lot going on. And I know we'll continue to talk to you soon when you get back here as well. So it'll be good to see you. But I thank you for taking the time and just keeping us updated on what's going on. It's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jim. Always a pleasure to be with you. Take care.
Brian Glynn Williams, our guest, professor from UMass Dartmouth. We will see him again as he keeps us updated on, again, the war in Ukraine. That's going to do it for this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.